Have you ever wondered, why do I keep doing this? Why is everything feel more challenging? And are you having a hard time figuring out what you need? Well, my guest today, Vanessa Roddenberry from Breda Psychological Services, gives us some insights on how trauma from the birth of our child can sometimes affect our parenting and our sleep. In our most sleep deprived moments, our children will teach us exactly what we need in order to learn and grow into who we were created to be. These are the loving lessons we will learn whether we were wanting to or not. I'm Irene Googe, your sleep coach, and I'm on mission to educate parents on how to help their young children sleep. Welcome to the journey. Well, hello and welcome to the Loving Lessons Learned podcast. I'm super excited to be here today with Vanessa Roddenberry, who is a licensed psychologist here in North Carolina. And she specializes in the treatment of psychological trauma as well as insomnia. She employs evidence-based therapies to help parents recover from trauma, regain healthy senses of safety, power and control, esteem, intimacy, and trust. All good things to have. And she has specialized training in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And if you are a parent struggling with the shadows of the past and adjusting to the current demands and problems with sleep, she can help. And I'm so excited to dive into all of this today, Vanessa.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Irene.
Yeah. And so tell me how you got into your world of dealing with trauma and sleep and how all of that came to be.
Absolutely. So I've always been really interested in psychological trauma and what people go through and how that changes them. And I actually started out as a cultural anthropology major, and I was really interested in stories of collective trauma and the concept of how that was navigated within different cultures and mythology. And then I realized I was also really more interested in how that shaped individuals. And that's what got me into psychology in grad school. And so I specialized in the assessment and treatment of PTSD and trauma-related issues. And when I got further training, I decided to go into the VA because I knew I wanted to have an environment where I would get a lot of opportunity to study and learn from experts in psychological trauma. And I loved that experience, and then decided to come into private practice in around 2012. And so throughout that experience, really saw a need for not just that interest in a provider, but also in the community. We needed a trauma specialty clinic. So my current clinic, Breda Psychological Services, has been in existence since 2018 when we opened that to speak to that need in our community.
And how did you come up with the name Breda?
Yeah, we get that question a lot.
I love it. Tell everybody about it. I know the story, so.
Yeah, it's got the inside track. Well, Breda means change in Icelandic language, and we really wanted a word that signified that change is the main goal. We're less preoccupied with specific symptoms or outcome ratings. Not that we aren't paying attention to that, but what we really want to help everybody do is create meaningful change in their life so that they can live life the way they want to live, and help them really kind of connect with what's important to them and be able to move towards that.
Yeah, I love you. I saw on your website you have change the tides of trauma and flow with life. And I love the word flow. Like, I want to go with the flow.
Yeah.
And I know that sometimes in parenting, we may have a hard time going with the flow. And I'm wondering if you can speak to talking a little bit about birth trauma and how it might affect the day-to-day parenting and sleep. And the reason I bring this up, because a lot of times when I'm talking with my families, they sometimes don't realize, like, because I'll ask them, like, well, what was your birth like? And so I wonder if you could dive into that a little bit more, and then I'll tell you why I asked them that question.
Love that question. Thank you for asking that. And you're so right, because I think that oftentimes birth trauma is one of those areas that isn't as well known or well publicized, even though it's something that happens so frequently to birthing parents. So, birth trauma is anything that happens during your delivery that might have been something that you found deeply stressful, hurtful. It could be an actual injury. So it could be that there was something medically that happened to you or the baby, and that was very terrifying and threatening, literally, to your well being. It can also be an emotional trauma where you did not feel heard or you felt disrespected in some way. Your wishes weren't taken into account, or there was something that you were deeply afraid of, even if nothing necessarily manifested from that. So there are a lot of different ways that we can experience psychological trauma or physiological trauma during the birth experience. Something that we saw a lot of, it's always been a possibility, but it increased during COVID, was something called obstetric violence, which is a very specific form of birth trauma, obviously, where you feel like your, procedures might be engaged in without your consent, or patently against your will, or you felt like you were medically disrespected or not cared for properly in some way. And again, that can be something that has a deep emotional impact, or it could also have a physical wound that accompanies that. And for many individuals, sometimes the experience of something that might be considered a medical procedure that's within the realm of expectation of birth, like a C-section, for example, can still
Mhm.
be traumatic. So trauma's the experience of something that basically kind of tears your world asunder. And a lot of times we really have difficulty processing that something like that happened or happened to us when we really did not foresee that. And so again, even though it's something that within the Western medical canon might be seen as a fairly typical procedure, sometimes the fact that something significant has happened medically that you weren't prepared for, or maybe it's an extremely difficult recovery that's impacting your thoughts about yourself or your ability to relate to your child or your partner or your other children if you have them. These are all different examples of how birth can have traumatic effects. And so we see a lot of individuals in our clinic that are struggling in different ways with the after effects of that, but might not have conceptualized it as a trauma. And so there is something very healing in and of itself in being able to name it as such and say, there's a reason why this is so hard, above and beyond the hard that comes with being a new parent.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you bring up the COVID season of life, because I think too, like, right. So there's the birth in general, which, again, I think can be hard on everybody and have a different experience, but then you were meant to do it by yourself, and limitations and restrictions and all the things. And so I think that could bring in new layers of it. I know when I ask parents this question, I've learned over the different seasons of sleep coaching and thinking about crying for children. One of the things I learned was that the crying will evoke those emotions. They'll like come up for you. And so I just bring it up with parents to say, hey, like when your child cries, it's going to stir those emotions up. What would you say to a parent that might be dealing with some of that? What would they need to do for like a next step?
Yeah, I love that question because you're so right. And I know you do such a fantastic job of that work too. It is really important to acknowledge that the experience of trauma, whether it's birth trauma or any other type of trauma, is going to activate your nervous system. And so when you think about different things that might be activating to your nervous system, hearing a crying infant is certainly one. We're kind of hardwired to respond to that with a sense of urgency. And that's great because it means that historically caregivers have responded in the way that they need to their babies. But it also is difficult if that's an ongoing stimulus. And so
Yes.
your body's constantly kind of in the high alert mode. If you combine that with trauma, which basically kind of leaves your body in sensitive threat assessment mode, and part of trauma treatment can help you recalibrate that. But if you haven't yet done that and your nervous system is very sensitive to anything in the environment that might be something to attune to, deemed a threat or something stressful, of which a crying baby could certainly be one, it is really hard because you're getting a lot of signals that are activating your fight or flight or freeze or fawn mode. And that response, again, is a normal response in your body, but it does result in kind of chronic stress and overactivation over time. So to your point, which is what do we do when we notice that's happening? There are some really great, quick and easy tools that you can try out. So in the moment, one of the best things that you can do if you notice that, hey, I'm really upregulated and I need some help coming down, is to do a quick grounding exercise. And one thing that we teach our clients is an easy exercise called Three Things I Hear, Feel, and See. And it's just like it sounds. It sounds like a I Spy, like a kid's game, but it's simple for a reason because when you're overactivated, you really need something quick and easy, like looking at the exit strategy. If you're in a hotel, even if your room's right there at the end, you want that little boop boop arrow that tells you in a moment of crisis exactly what to do. And it's simple. So that's why this is this way too. But you essentially want to use your sensory data to force your mind to be in the here and now. Because when we're upset, our cognitions or our thoughts are usually referencing the future or the past. We're worried about something that hasn't happened yet, and that's getting us really upset, or we're worried about something that's happened in the past that we can't do anything about anymore.
Hmm.
So to bring you back to the present, you would simply say, kind of Rolodex through three things I hear, feel, and see. And you want to give yourself a rich description of that. So if I'm saying I hear a bird, that's not quite as engaging as if I say, okay, I can hear the sort of chortle and warbling of a robin on the windowsill outside and other bird song. And as you go through your senses, focus on your breathing. You want to take slow, deep breaths because when we're anxious, we breathe more rapidly and shallowly. So as you go through your sensory data, you're focusing on that type of breathing. But then you also want to ensure that you remain tied to your tasks. So, for example, by the time you get to things you see, you want to say, hey, here's something that can describe richly, almost as if someone wasn't there to see it with you. So if you're describing a painting or a piece of carpet, you can really say, okay, this is a rectangular colored carpet with a short nap and a wave pattern, and it's aqua colored. And it sounds like a small difference, but it actually does matter versus saying, well, there's a rug on the floor. And by the time you're finished, it has not taken very long. No one even knows you're doing it, but you've grounded yourself back in the present moment and helped bring down that activation.
I love when parents have a tool belt of grounding tools and skills because I think sometimes at any given moment with little ones, you just need to be ready because they will probably set you off at any given time.
So true.
That is the parenting journey because you know what? I think it's interesting because our children are always in that present state. And I think as adults, we don't practice that enough to learn to live in the present state. That's why I love like the go with the flow of life. Like we have a harder time. We're like, I want to be in the past or I want to be in the future. We kind of forget to be in the now, here now. Vanessa, I'm wondering, does everybody experience trauma?
The majority of people in the world will, at some point in their lives, experience an event that we would deem traumatic. And it's actually the statistics we have on it tell us that, probably 75% of people out there are going to experience something like that, right? But that's probably underreported, because if you think about the fact that a lot of people may not conceptualize their experience as trauma related, even though it may be, there's that. They're the amount of people that either because they don't know or because they do and there's stigma related to it, don't seek help, and so they're not counted. That tells us that the statistics we have currently tell us that it's probably even more than we know. But suffice it to say that most people will encounter something traumatic in their life, and there's been a shift within the psychology world in the last several decades away from a really tight definition of trauma. In the DSM, it still is a more traditional sense that trauma is something that is life-threatening, and that can happen to yourself or someone that you're witnessing, or you could learn of it, and if it's severe enough, it can be traumatic. But we know as clinicians that oftentimes there are things in your life that might be traumatic that are not necessarily, again, that what we would call in the past a big T trauma or a kind of a crash bang trauma. Oftentimes it's something that is just a really difficult thing. And it's different for everybody because trauma is subjective. Everybody has a worldview that they start with. And if something tears that asunder, or if you've had a negative experience that would seem to confirm that, if you have a pre-existing negative view, either of those can result in a lot of problematic thoughts that really keep you stuck. And so it's possible to have emotional trauma without physical wounds that is deeply troubling. So it could be a really difficult divorce, or, something that happened to someone that you love that was very disturbing to learn of. But again, this is all to say that there are a lot of different reasons why issues might come and pop up and cause you trouble. We see a lot of clients in our clinic who are experiencing what we call family of origin issues. And this is often again, what we would historically call little t trauma, but something that's problematic or very difficult to navigate. But it may not have been outright abuse, but it's shaping the way that they're functioning now. And it can do everything from, to bring it back to parenting, affect the person's view on becoming a parent and that journey. And if they think that they'll be a good parent or not, or the way that they're relating to their partner and how they feel about intimacy. It can be something that happens in the context of gestation and pregnancy. It could be trauma related to infertility, or it could be, as we've talked about, a birth trauma. So there are a lot of different avenues that people find us, but we have found that recognizing trauma as such can be really powerful, because that's when we start to be able to make room for self-compassion.
Just as you were speaking about all of that, it makes me think about my personal journey, because I was dealing with intrusive thoughts when I was pregnant, and then when my son was here, and I didn't even realize that it was intrusive thoughts for the longest time. I thought everybody thinks that. And then I hear from a lot of moms too, when I'm working, like, oh my gosh, I'm having these thoughts come up for me. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that in terms of like what moms or parents might need to know and understand when those thoughts come up for them.
Absolutely. That's such a wonderful example, because it is a common experience. I think that there's even a really excellent book called Good Moms Have Bad Thoughts.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it really, yeah, it normalizes the experience, because finding that you have this tiny person here in the world that you're responsible for is a huge change. And so it's normal to have a lot of anxiety around that, and kind of perseverate on some thoughts related to the safety of your child or your actions related to the child. But if you realize that this is becoming so intense that it's causing you problems where you feel like you're having trouble engaging in some way in the parenting process, or it's having secondary effects on behavior, then that might be a good time to talk with somebody to get some support and help around that. But the experience in and of itself is really common. And so I'm so glad that you can share that and normalize it. And it's the same with trauma related symptoms. So trauma is, again, a normal reaction to an abnormal event. That's why it's traumatic, is because it's not something that you foresaw happening or is possible
Mhm.
for you. And so when you're faced with a threat, your body responds in a certain way, and it activates your fight or flight system. The problem is, after the event is over and is gone on the timeline, you carry the thoughts about it, the meaning that you make from it, and the memories forward with you. And frequently, if you're reminded of them, it's kind of like pulling a string of Christmas lights, and that you can't just access a memory without bringing a lot of other things with it. So finding, for example, that you're having intrusive thoughts about the event that you deem to be traumatic is part of it, right? So your brain is trying to tell you there's something that we still need to deal with. It's kind of like knocking on the door, or flopping open to the worst part. And because that's aversive, most of us will slam that book shut and say, I would prefer not to think about that. But the
Yes.
problem is, avoidance can kind of perpetuate those symptoms. So if you're noticing some symptoms related to something you've gone through, know that the symptoms themselves are not anything to be afraid of, even though they might feel aversive, and there is hope for treating them. And Irene, I think you said you can put this in the show notes, but if you look on our Instagram, we do have a guide that talks about recognizing PTSD,
Mm.
as well as navigating sleep following a big life adjustment. So both of those things might be helpful in knowing, is this something that is a normal response, or might I be at a level where I would want to get help for this?
That's great. I'm going to share those show notes. I'll put the links in the show notes so the parents can have access to that. It was interesting something you said, like, again, we may have these intrusive thoughts. I've done a lot of work personally to work through some of that. And over time, I never realized something you said earlier that remind me was like family of origin things. I didn't realize, like, growing up in an alcoholic household, like that was like considered chronic trauma that I was exposed to, and like the patterns and behaviors that I had of codependency were coming up for me. And so, like, I had spent all these years not knowing and understanding, like, why do I keep doing these things? Where does this behavior and
Yes.
pattern come from? And so I think for me, one of the things I learned was like meeting with a professional to be able to talk through, and like what you talked about, conceptualizing, making sense of it, making that meaning was really helpful to be able to say, hey, I can respond differently. I can choose to change my thoughts. And that has been a journey for me. I wonder if you could talk to the parent that's listening to understand, like, how long does that process normally take a parent to go through?
Absolutely. So we use an evidence-based treatment for trauma called cognitive processing therapy. And that's CPT for short, but basically it just helps you look at how your thoughts and feelings have changed based on what you went through. And there is a set number of sessions for that. It's a 12 session protocol. So after intake, if you went session by session, it would be 13 total meetings. So it's a lot shorter than people anticipate, and it's highly effective. However, we also tailor treatments for our clients. So if you needed to work on something else in conjunction or flex a little bit on that, we can certainly do it. We can also offer that within a shorter time frame. So if someone says, hey, I have a certain amount of leave and I'd like to accomplish this before I have to go back to work, we can do what's called a masked treatment or more intensive treatment, and do more frequent sessions as long as we make it through the protocol. What's involved is being able to acknowledge, here's the instance that's causing me trouble. We're going to work on processing that and walking through it. Again, instead of that book flopping open to the worst part, we want to start at the beginning and go all the way through so that you can close it. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's not going to bother you in the same way. And we teach you a lot of cognitive skills. So just like you're saying, Irene, you can learn to better recognize some patterns and how you can address those and change your relationship to them. And we also teach you some mindfulness and acceptance tools that can help you be with distress in a different way so that you don't feel like you have to avoid it or engage in behaviors that might cause even more problems. And we help you look at areas that you're affected in, because everybody that goes through a traumatic event finds that they're affected in the areas of safety, trust, power and control, esteem, and intimacy. Some conglomeration of those is usually
All of
pretty.
that.
Yeah, that resonates for folks. So we help you kind of look at your thinking there, but that's a typical arc. And for someone that might want to work on more than one trauma, that's certainly possible too. We can just tack on a few extra sessions, but we usually give folks that rubric as a base.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful to know. And I wonder, what would you say to the parent listening that's like, so then I'll be fixed after 12 sessions? Is that right, Vanessa? I'll be
Right.
all better? Like,
But
I'm
yes, we
good?
do our magic wand. That's a great question. I wish that I could say that everything was all completely fixed after 12 sessions. What that 12 sessions allows us to do is to say, okay, how intensely are you being bothered by symptoms related to PTSD? And oftentimes for folks, there's a level that is what we will consider a clinically significant level. Like, okay, this is bad enough that like, yeah, we need to tackle this together. But after that treatment with 12 sessions, we find that can come down to a place where for many folks, it no longer meets criteria for the majority of folks. And so in that sense, we can say that the person no longer has PTSD. However, oftentimes what happens is once that noise quiets down and is no longer at the forefront of the picture, sometimes our clients recognize, just as we're talking about, like, okay, we talked about some of the origins of these thoughts, and I find that they're related to some family of origin issues. And so we do have clients that will elect to work on other things. So it's not always a quick and done 13 sessions. They might work on family of origin or insomnia or something like that, or decide, to work on some relationship issues. But what we always tell everybody is that the treatment doesn't mean that it didn't happen at all. And so there will be times where there's still waves in the ocean. It's not that we're creating an environment where you never have to deal with any discomfort. We're helping you become really excellent sailors so that when those waves show up, you know what to do. Just like you were saying, Irene, about having tools in your tool bag. That's our goal.
Yeah. No, I love that. For the longest time, I was trying to fix it and make it go away because I believed for the longest time that would happen. And I think a lot of times I think I ended up having complex trauma is what it would be classified as, and realizing that no, I have overcome so many of those things, but I guess I didn't realize that I was overcoming it, because for the longest time I thought I was still recovering. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the cycle of because I think for the longest time I was in a victim mindset and I was stuck in that loop for the longest time. So can you help parents kind of understand maybe where they're at in their journey or their process as they work through trauma?
Yes, I love that. And that's a great segue into talking about what we call the triphasic model of trauma. And so we sort of conceptualize it as victim, survivor, thriver. And victim is sort of a charged word. Most people don't like that word. And so it just means that you've experienced something distressing, and that was during the event or the time frame. But when folks come to us, they're in the survivor frame, and so we can help them understand the impact of what occurred in that first time frame and do our work there. But in that process, they are learning to thrive and come out the other side of that experience. So it's basically the hero's journey as coined by Joseph Campbell, right? Where something, every culture has their version of this, but oftentimes in a story, a hero will encounter some challenge and they have to go out and do this. And it's harrowing at times, but then they come back and they're able to take something from that. And so we also engage in some meaning making after we complete trauma treatment, some positive psychology work. And that's really helpful in figuring out where you want to go next. But as you were saying, Irene, I think that one of the most incredible parts of our work together is being able to see clients, parents, conceptualize things that way and understand like, yes, this has been a struggle, this has been hard, but the very act of getting help, whether it's reaching out to you for sleep work or coming to us for trauma work, being able to acknowledge that you have been through something and you deserve care and there's something on the other side of it, that's such an incredibly powerful step. And so, yes, healing's not linear. It's usually really messy. And everyone
very
thinks it
messy.
looks like this, but it looks like this.
For sure. I think I was looking for I just want to go here to there and be done, like throw it away and be done and let's move on.
Don't we all? Right.
And that has definitely not been the case. And that is what makes parenting and this life journey of life more interesting for sure. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because, where when we met, we were talking about trauma and how it impacts sleep. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when we don't resolve some of the trauma, how you notice it come up for families with sleep issues.
Sure. So, in terms of how it could affect an individual parent, they're going to be experiencing things potentially. Not everyone has every symptom, but things that can track with trauma that would affect sleep would be intrusive thoughts or anxiety that might make it difficult to get to sleep, related to safety related fears. It can also be nightmares that wake you up. It could be, sometimes we have clients that are also struggling with the physical side of things. If their trauma has had a physical component, there can be some chronic pain that impacts comfortability, being able to get to sleep or stay asleep. We also notice that the hypervigilance or hyperawareness piece is something that is very difficult because being able to turn off is really hard. And so we work a lot with bedtime routines and things like that in the same way that you would with kids to help them learn to relax and downregulate. But as it relates to the parenting dynamic, a lot of times, one of those areas I mentioned that's affected by trauma is control, power and control. And so it can be very distressing if you've gone through something traumatic and it felt like there was no control. Control was wrested from you in some way. And you're dealing with a little person who has their own agenda and it's kind of all over the place. It can be really upsetting to not be able to stick to a routine if a routine has been something that has been comforting in some way for you in the past. So we see a lot of folks that are really struggling with trying to co-regulate their sleep with their infants or their child's sleep. And sometimes we even see parents who are struggling with their general sleep hygiene, even in terms of where they're sleeping, because they might have fear about something happening. And so they're sleeping on the floor of their child's room, or, there are other types of sleep scenarios that might be disruptive to them. So those are just some examples.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many things that can impact that sleep. And I think that one of the misunderstandings I find that parents have a lot of times is not recognizing that need for safety and security is that first and foremost that we need. And then, of course, being able to learn to settle and then have that sleep pressure that lets us go to sleep. But if we have these anxious thoughts, and I know for me, I used to have really bad panic attacks, and it was a lot of like unresolved grief and trauma and things like that were just lingering under the surface that I was like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this. And so I'm wondering if you can share how people can learn and connect with you, because maybe they have that and they're like, I don't want to deal with this, but maybe they really need to know a resource to connect with.
Sure. Yeah, it's really hard to keep the beach ball under the water.
It is,
I
yes.
hear that. Yeah. But if someone would like to connect with us to talk about any of these types of things, you can certainly find us on our website, which is www.bredapsych.com, or you can give us a call at 919-245-7791. Extension 5 gets you our front desk for scheduling or general questions. But we do offer 15-minute complimentary consultations. So if you'd just like some questions answered to learn if maybe therapy might be something that's a good fit for you, or if you'd like to talk with specific providers to see how they are, and if you think that you'd be a match with them, then you're welcome to do that too.
Because you have an amazing team of providers. I got to listen in on one of your open house sessions. And so they specialize in different types of trauma as well. Is that correct?
That's right. Thank you, Irene, for mentioning that and for being there. We really enjoyed having you there. But we're really proud of our team. We have a lot of different areas of specialty and trauma focus. So we work with everything from birth trauma, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, religious trauma, culturally informed care, LGBTQ plus issues, and sleep, of course. So trauma related sequelae. We have psychologists that specialize in health and health related anxiety or depression. And we pretty much run the full gamut, but you're able to see all of our providers' bios on the website. We also have a provider that specializes in working with parents who are struggling with emotionally sensitive children. So we have a little bit of everything. We also offer couples therapy. Sometimes if you're not sleeping and you're adjusting to a new baby, that could be something that's helpful too.
Yeah. One other question that comes to mind before we dive into our last series of questions is, can we share our trauma experiences with our children?
Good question. So usually it to give a therapist answer, it depends.
It depends. That's the best answer.
It's an annoying therapist answer. But essentially, there's sort of age appropriate disclosure for different ages. And I think that oftentimes you want to take into account kind of where your child is and the reasons for disclosure. But we certainly have many parents who have found that as their child becomes older, it's something that is not that they disclose the full trauma per se, but they can share like, hey, something happened to me and it's kind of affected the way I think about this area. And that's really powerful because it really helps the child have context for some reactions at times and understand, okay, this might not be me, but mom or dad or whoever went through something and it's made him a little bit sensitive to sounds or something like that if there's a startle response. And I think also there can be a lot of power in modeling healthy recovery and how you relate to your emotional health. So being able to say, yeah, I went through something really hard when I was younger or earlier this year, whenever it was. And because I care about myself and I know I deserve help, I'm working with a feelings doctor on this. And that's been really helpful in letting me, change the way I think about things. So there's sort of a way that you can say it that gives them a lot of insight in an age appropriate way.
I love that. I love feelings doctor. Yes, I didn't say that one, but that's a good one to throw into my tool belt. I used to say, Mommy's just going to go get some help right now. Like, I'm going to see one of my helpers. And so I would go and get one of my helpers to help me. And so it was really great to be able to talk about the things that like I was doing to take care of myself along the way and model that hopefully healthy behavior for my boys.
Yes, absolutely.
Along the journey. Well, we could probably chat all day because you and I love talking about trauma and sleep. We dive deep into all the things here. But I want to wrap up with our top five loving lessons learned. And so I wonder if you have a favorite parenting product or service that you love.
Well, it's not necessarily a product, but it is a service. And I have to say, doulas are just angels in everyday life. So I really strongly recommend that if you're on the parenting journey and you're wondering what to do, one of the best things you can do to invest in yourself is to work with a doula like Irene. There are different kinds of doulas out there, but every parent that we've worked with that has used a doula has had such a wonderful, supportive experience. And we know from the literature that social support is a protective factor for the development of PTSD. And oftentimes, even if you're navigating something really difficult, having someone in your corner that has expertise that can be with you is so powerful. So that's one of our most recommended services for parents.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Yes, I would highly recommend doulas because I didn't have one and I could have used one.
Same.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, where were we back in the day? What would you say is your best self-care tip?
So my best self-care tip is always going to be asking, what do I need? Because if you have a routine, it's easy to say I've fallen on or off of it and have all or nothing thoughts around that. But if you know in a moment when I'm feeling upset, if the first thing that you do is say, what do I need? It has a few things that are tied to it. So you have to name why you're upset essentially to figure out what you need. So there's emotion naming entailed in that, which is really powerful. We know because when you name it, you tame it. But the other piece is it brings in an element of self-compassion, and it's acknowledging that, yes, I'm upset and that is what it is, but what do I need now? So there's sort of a radical acceptance component that brings you right back into kind of self-nurturance and self-care. So I love asking that question when you feel upset.
Oh, I love that. Actually, I'm going to add that to my self-care tip. I guess I didn't think about that. Like, I do think about, like, what do I need in this moment? Like when I'm being triggered or set off or anything like that. I'm like, okay, but that is a good self-care. Like, what do I need right now?
Yeah.
Good. What is something you thought you would never do or say?
Hmm. As a psychologist or as a parent?
Either one. Either one. Anything off
Well,
the
most recently, it was 4th of July weekend a while back, and my youngest has been calling it Portage Alive. And he had a foam sword that he was brandishing. And so I yelled across the yard, put down the Portage Alive sword. And that is something I did not envision in my
Love
life.
it. Those are those sweet little moments. Love it. Write it down, put it on the books. You'll forget it and you'll remind them later when they're teenagers and then they'll roll their eyes at you.
Absolutely.
I
Yes.
love it. And what is the one thing that you want parents to walk away with after our conversation today? What do you want them to really know?
I would hope that anyone listening understands that if you've gone through something in your life that has been really difficult, it's understandable that it's going to stick with you. And if it's causing you significant problems in your relationships and your parenting and your relationship with yourself, or the way that you think about the world, know that there is hope. PTSD, or just having gone through trauma and the problems related to that, that's all eminently treatable. There are treatments that work and it doesn't last forever.
Yes. And as a business owner, what is something you've learned in your entrepreneurial journey?
I think the importance of community and networking is something that I've known intellectually, but as I meet other providers out there, it's always so refreshing and wonderful to connect because our area, I know every area has a lot of wonderful providers, but it seems like ours in particular just has such an incredible wealth of different expertise and knowledge. And so I've learned that it's wonderful to have a business as a service, but it's so helpful to be able to work with other providers to offer clients wraparound services.
Yeah. Wow, I so love that. It was a pleasure meeting you at an event with Build to Birth and at Verve Chiropractic. And it's again, you're meeting all these different providers, and it's like having connections and conversations about things that, like, you know what, we're all people and parents dealing with the day-to-day stuff. So it's good to have a connecting network.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been so wonderful to be able to have you on our referral list, Irene.
So fun. Well, Vanessa, thank you again for being here with us today. And I'll have everything down in the show notes. And we will see you hopefully next time, and we'll dive into other topics. Take care. Thanks for tuning into today's show. You can see all of the details and show notes below. And as you go out into your day, I hope that you'll make it your mission to be calm, confident, and rested as you lead today. Sweet dreams.